Hey there, my name is Salandrak and welcome to the second video of my Path of Exile guide for total beginners. These videos are for players who are completely new to Path of Exile or who, for whatever reason, have never gotten very far into the game. In the last guide, I helped you understand the passive skill tree and gave you an overview of the different leagues and character class options to help you get started. In this guide, I'll go over a bunch of stuff that will help you understand and play the game, including some settings options, useful keybinds, and a lot of tips and useful information that will help you make it through the main story campaign without using any build guides. And in the next two videos, I'll provide you with even more information that will help you complete the campaign if you get stuck, as well as provide you with critical knowledge that will help you transition into playing in the post-campaign endgame. As with all my guide videos, timestamps are down in the description, as are links to other resources you might find useful. Now let's get to it! Before we get into the game itself, let's talk about some options you may want to tweak, as I feel they take a few rough edges off the gameplay experience, starting with map settings on the UI tab. By default, pressing tab will move the minimap from the top right corner to a center of the screen overlay position, which is how I like to play, as it really helps me navigate zones much better. But also by default, it has this landscape transparency stuff, which adds a lot of useless additional clutter, so you may want to turn it all the way down to make the overlay less intrusive. You can also adjust the transparency and zoom. A little further down in the items settings, you'll want to make sure that always show sockets is selected, as the number, color, and links of sockets is often the most important aspect of your gear. If this option isn't selected, sockets will only be shown when hovering over an item. Show full descriptions is also a good option to have on, as it will show the full pop-up information when hovering over an item on the ground, which can be nice. And the support gem utility pop-up is also one you'll want to have on, as it will show which of your active gems can and cannot be supported by a given support gem that you might be considering. Feel free to play around with the different gameplay options to see what you like best, though I would keep the hide life mana reservation option turned off, as the reduced volume of the bubbles is a good indication that your reservation skills are actually active. If your cursor has a tendency to get lost amidst the on-screen effects, go ahead and try other color and size options, and to wrap up UI options, I would definitely turn off global and trade chat, as they will be constantly spamming your screen with distractions that you just don't need. On the input tab, you might want to consider rebinding your hotkeys. By default, the game puts your main actions on Q, W, E, R, T, with your flasks on 1 through 5. I personally prefer to have the actions set to A, S, D, F, G, where I normally like my hand to be anyways, and move the flasks down a row to Q, W, E, R for the first 4 flasks, with the 5th bound to spacebar, as this makes it much easier to hit any or all of your flasks quickly whenever needed. Note that if you do this, you may need to rebind other settings that might have gotten displaced. A few other hotkeys that are worth mentioning include pressing Ctrl left click to transfer items between 2 open windows, such as from your inventory to your stash or a vendor. Shift left click will allow you to pick up a portion of a stack, and you can use the mouse wheel to increase or decrease the amount, or simply type in the number of items that you want. And if you are holding a stack of items, shift left click will let you put down one item at a time. On the passive skill tree, you can immediately lock in a skill by holding Ctrl and then left clicking on the skill, avoiding the need to click the Apply Points button. And finally, holding Alt while hovering over an item will show you more detailed information about the item, including its level and the tiers, names, and types of any item modifiers. With those settings considerations out of the way, let's get into actually playing the game. And for this part of the guide, I'm going to keep it more to general principles, considerations, and information rather than telling you exactly what to do, as a large part of the fun of a game like this is learning and exploring on your own. But a few good pointers can go a long way in making sure you don't steer yourself into the wrong direction. Tip number 1, experiment a lot. As you first start playing Path of Exile, the game will expose you to all sorts of different skills and items. Many of these will drop from enemies and containers while out in the world, while you'll also regularly get skill gems, equipment, and flasks from town NPCs as quest rewards. Particularly when it comes to skill gems, it's a good idea to try out a variety of gems to see what sorts of abilities and playstyles you find to be not only effective, but also enjoyable to use. Sometimes there may be multiple gems as a quest reward that you might want to try, but don't worry, regardless of which one you pick as a reward, there will usually be a vendor nearby that will sell the other options and sometimes even more. So be sure to check the vendors pretty regularly to see what might be for sale. Note that the quest rewards and hence gems sold by vendors will vary based on the class you are playing, but as you play more and try different character classes, you'll start to develop preferred playstyles and preferences. And later on, you can use a higher level character of a different class to mule skill gems to a class that otherwise wouldn't have access to a particular gem in the early acts of the game. Tip number 2, try to specialize. Although it's a good idea to experiment with the wide variety of weapons and skills, especially as you're just starting out, it's also important to start to specialize your character as you move further and further into the game. This is because doing well in Path of Exile requires taking advantage of lots of small little bonuses focused on a cohesive character build. Spread yourself too thin across a wide variety of offensive and defensive options, then you just won't end up being effective at much of anything. So for example, suppose you start out as a witch and notice that your first quest reward options include a mix of lightning, ice, chaos, and minion related skills, with a few additional options sold by the vendor Nessa. Although it's perfectly fine to use a mix of these active skill gems for the first several levels, even if it's only to see what they're like, as you get further into the game you'll usually want to pick one or maybe two primary abilities for dealing damage, and will want to focus passive skill points towards boosting that specific type of damage. Further into the game there will be a variety of compatible skills that you can swap to, but it will be harder and harder to switch to a completely different type of ability. So going back to our witch example, let's say that early on you find that you like the cold ability Freezing Pulse, but also find that having a few zombies around as meat shields is pretty handy. At that point you might want to search the passive skill tree for nearby nodes that will boost your Freezing Pulse damage, such as spell, projectile, elemental, and/or cold damage skills, or minion damage, but probably won't want to invest in both. And later on, you really probably won't want to switch over to something completely different, such as fire or physical damage dealing abilities, but you would be perfectly fine swapping your Freezing Pulse skill for a different skill that also deals cold damage. Now, these are just generalizations, and later in your PoE career you might come across builds that do a mix of things, but doing so requires advanced understanding of sometimes very complex game mechanics. So when you're just starting out, keep it simple and stick to a single damage type such as cold, fire, lightning, chaos, or physical. Oh, and don't worry too much about making mistakes here and there, as it is part of the learning process. Throughout the game you'll be given passive refund points that will allow you to unlearn passive skills so that you can place them elsewhere. Just remember that all of your passive skills must always be connected back to your character's starting position on the skill tree. So if you want to refund a skill in the middle of a long chain of skills, you might need to first find another route to connect your further out skills before refunding the unwanted skills. In terms of defense, you'll also want to pick up defensive and utility passive skills that are in the neighborhood of whatever damage nodes you might be interested in. Passive skills that boost your life and resistances are scattered all over the skill tree, and depending on what type of gear you favor, you may want to boost your armor, energy shield, chance to block with shield, chance to suppress spell damage, or evasion. Don't be too restrictive on the types of defensive skills you take, as multiple defensive layers is generally a good idea and goes a long way to keep you from getting killed a lot. Just make sure you actually have gear that will benefit from such defensive passive skills, as, for example, passive skills that boost your evasion rating won't do you much good if you aren't wearing any gear that requires dexterity, and thus provide you with evasion rating in the first place. 100% more of 0 is still 0. Tip number 3, flesh out your character with supporting abilities. Although you'll generally only want at most a couple of primary damage dealing abilities, there are a wide variety of support abilities that you can work into your build to provide various offensive and defensive benefits to your character. For example, almost all builds will want to use at least one type of movement ability, and a few options, such as Frost Blink, Dash, Leap Slam, and Flame Dash, become available as quest rewards and/or from vendors during Act 1, though again, specific availability will vary from class to class. Another type of ability generally used by almost all builds is auras, which start showing up about midway through Act 1. These abilities reserve a portion of your mana, making it unavailable for using other abilities, but in doing so, the aura provides a constant benefit to you and any nearby allies, including other players and friendly minions. For example, the Clarity Aura is nice for early game casters as it provides a constant mana regeneration boost. As you progress through the game, you'll find all sorts of auras that boost various types of damage, as well as types of defenses and other effects. Other skills that reserve mana include heralds that provide damage dealing effects, and banners which can be worn or placed on the ground. When worn, the buff is weaker, but they gain stages as enemies are defeated, that are then consumed when the banner is placed on the ground to provide an even stronger buff. Other useful support abilities include various totems, which can be primary damage dealing abilities or used in a variety of supportive roles, as well as minions, including the different types of golems that each provide you with a different type of buff. Curses are another type of ability that almost all builds use at least one of, as these spells weaken your enemies in a variety of ways and have several means by which they can be applied, including direct casting, as well as indirect application through the use of various support gems like Blasphemy, Hex Touch, and Arcanist Brand. Moral of the story: while moving through the game, focus on using one or at most a few primary damage dealing abilities, but also try to work in a variety of supporting abilities to increase your mobility, boost your defensive layers, buff your offensive capabilities, and weaken your enemies. Tip number 4, use support gems. In addition to active abilities, there are also tons of support gems in Path of Exile that, when linked to an active skill, will enhance it in various ways and make it more powerful. This is demonstrated in the very first zone of Act 1, but as you progress through the game, you should always be looking for additional opportunities to support your most important active skills with support gems, especially your primary damage dealing abilities. This is most easily done in the early acts by visiting a gem vendor, typing the word support in the search field, and then looking at the gem descriptions to see what the different gems do. And assuming you turned on the support gem utility option I talked about earlier, when mousing over support gems, to the side of the description will be a window showing a list of your equipped active skills with a green check mark indicating the support is compatible with the skill and a red X if it isn't. It doesn't matter what order you place active and support skills into the sockets of an item, nor does it generally matter into which items the different skills are placed. For example, if your main damage skill is a melee strike attack like Molten Strike, you can put that skill and its supports in any item. It does not need to be in your weapon. But you will of course need to make sure you have the right colors of sockets and that those sockets are connected with links. Because of the power that comes from linking active skills with support gems, it is highly recommended that while working your way through the main story campaign, you primarily focus on picking up only items that have good combinations of socket colors and linked sockets, as you'll generally get much more benefit for your character from a piece of gear with good socket colors and links but not terribly useful item mods than you will from an item with otherwise good mods but a bad socket setup. Now, the availability of both active and support gems is pretty limited for the first several acts of the game, but towards the end of Act 3 there's an area called the Library, which is home to an NPC named Siosa. Complete the quest he gives you and he'll sell more gems than all the previous vendors combined, with different tabs organizing them by color with separate tabs for active and support gems. Later on in Act 6 you'll gain access to the stockpile of NPC Lily Roth, who sells almost every normal gem in the game, allowing you to really set up your skills and try lots of different gems, assuming you've got the right socket colors and links. And on the topic of sockets, here's more information you need to understand about how they work. The number of sockets an item has can be re-rolled by using an item called a Jeweler's Orb, but the maximum number of sockets an item can potentially have is limited by the type of item and, to a lesser extent, by the item's level. Shields and one-handed weapons can have at most 3 sockets, boots, gloves, and helmets can have at most 4, and body armor, two-handed weapons, and bows can have up to 6 sockets. The accessory items of rings, amulets, and belts can also sometimes have sockets, but this is far less common and most builds don't use socketed accessories. The maximum number of sockets items can have when they naturally drop out in the world, are sold by vendors, or are rerolled with jeweler's orbs is limited by the item's level, which you can see by holding Alt while hovering over the item. Regardless of item type, almost all items in the first 2 acts of the main story campaign are capped at 3 sockets, and you'll need gear with an item level of at least 25 to get 4 sockets, which starts dropping in the 3rd act. Items of level 35 are needed to get 5 sockets, and item level 50 is required to get 6 sockets. Spamming jeweler's orbs trying to get 4 or more sockets on an item that is only level 20 just won't work, though the game will let you know that you have the maximum number of possible sockets when using this method. There are, however, a couple of ways around the socket number restriction due to the item's level. One option is to use an Orb of Binding that will upgrade a normal item to rare with up to 4 linked sockets limited by item type. Orbs of Binding can start showing up in Act 3, but can be used to get 4 linked sockets on items of any level, assuming the item can have that many. You can also use the crafting bench in your hideout to adjust the number of sockets independent of the item's level, though you won't learn any recipes to do so until Act 4. The hideout itself will become available to your first character in a given league in Act 2, but thereafter it and all unlocked recipes will be available to all of your characters in that same league as soon as they reach the first town. Socket colors can be re-rolled using an item called a chromatic orb, but the probability of getting certain color combinations is weighted by the item's stat requirements. So for example, if an item requires really high strength, it will generally roll primarily red sockets and will have a hard time getting more than 1 or 2 off-color blue and or green sockets. By contrast, if an item requires equal amounts of strength and dexterity, then a mix of red and green sockets will be common, but all red or all green will be hard to get, as will more than 1 or 2 off-color blue sockets. There are also crafting bench recipes that can manipulate socket colors, but if you want to maximize your chances of getting the right color combinations, I highly recommend using the Verici calculator linked down in the description, so you can be sure you're using the most efficient method of getting the colors you need. Getting enough of these orbs to actually get the right colors is another story, but I'll mention one method in a bit. But enough about sockets, let's move on to tip number 5. Don't restrict yourself to specific item types or colors of skill gems. As a new player, it's easy to get the impression that you should limit yourself to using only whatever skill gems and equipment match the colors of the primary starting attributes of your starter class, but nothing could be further from the truth. Although generally speaking, your active skills will tend to be supported by matching colored gems, this is also not universally the case, as there are regularly supports that work fantastically well with primary skills of a different color. And although you'll tend to have much higher core attributes for whatever part of the tree you're placing most of your skill points, there are several nodes that give plus 30 to one attribute or plus 20 to both attributes from different parts of the tree. Taking these nodes can be helpful when you need more of a particular stat to equip certain items or to level up your off-color skill gems, as can equipping stat-boosting jewelry or other items with stat-boosting mods. Moral of the story, remain flexible in your approach to the game and don't think that any given class is restricted to any particular types of items or colors of skill gems. Tip number 6, focus on items that give life and resistances. I'll explain in detail the basics of how items and item modifiers work in the next video, but for now just know that in addition to good socket colors, numbers, and links, the most important mods you'll want to have on items while leveling up in the campaign is more life and more resistances. Life of course is needed so you can stay standing longer while taking damage, because most people would agree running back to where you just died isn't a whole lot of fun. Energy shield can also be nice, particularly if you are building a character focused on intelligence, but targeting it generally isn't needed in the early stages of the game. But other than life, one of the most important stats to look for in your armor and accessories is elemental and chaos resistances. This is because there will be lots of sources of damage getting thrown at you throughout the game, and Path of Exile is balanced around you having 75% resistance to fire, cold, and lightning, and at least 0% resistance to chaos damage. You generally don't need to worry too much about resistances for the first couple of acts of the main campaign, though at least some cold resistance is helpful for the final boss of Act 1. But by about Act 4, you should try to get your resistances capped at 75% for fire, cold, and lightning, and the sooner you start getting these, the better. Do note though that when you enter Act 6, the game will apply a minus 30% penalty to all of your resistances, and another minus 30% after you've completed the main story. One of the easiest ways to keep your resistances topped off is through the various accessory items, as well as adding resistances to rare items using the crafting bench in your hideout. Just be sure to check the defenses tab of your character screen regularly, and do what you can to boost any lagging numbers. There are also lots of passive skills scattered all over the skill tree that can not only boost your resistances, but also increase your maximum resistance beyond the normal cap of 75%. So be on the lookout for any of these that are in the vicinity of other nodes you might be interested in taking. And as a companion to this tip, here's tip number 7, don't pick up useless junk. As is common with ARPGs, Path of Exile is known for its loot explosions that litter the ground with tons of totally useless junk, where decent items are few and far between. Many new players develop the bad habit of picking almost everything up, returning to town regularly to vendor their full inventories, and spending absurd amounts of time examining items trying to determine if they are either useful for their character or worth trying to trade to other players. The reality though is that the vast majority of items that drop in this game, whether rare, unique, or otherwise, are total garbage and not worth spending even a second looking at, much less picking up to vendor. Exceptions, of course, are all types of currency items, especially when you're leveling through the campaign or on a first character in a new league, and any items that might be good upgrades for your character while you're leveling up, such as armor pieces with good socket arrangements, higher tier weapons of the type your character favors, and accessory items. Go ahead and ID rare items of these types, and maybe even pick up normal items that have good socket arrangements, as you can always hit it with an alchemy orb or an essence and hopefully get something good. And when you're hovering over an item, you can hold control to compare the viewed item with the one you have equipped. If it's an upgrade, go ahead and use it. If not, go ahead and sell it to a vendor who will reward you with shards and or currency items that you'll also want to save. Generally speaking though, the main campaign is pretty forgiving gear-wise, and other than adequate levels of life and resistances, you generally do not need optimized gear to get through this stage of the game, though better gear always helps. Other items that are worth picking up are upgrades for your mana and life flasks, as well as utility flasks. Another item type I like to pick up during the campaign, especially on a first character in a new league, is anything with linked red, green, and blue sockets. Whatever the rarity, vendors will always give you a chromatic orb for these, which you'll want to stockpile early on to help you get correct socket colors for your items later. Items with 6 sockets should also be vendored, as they'll get you 7 jeweler's orbs, and if you're lucky enough to get a 6 linked item that's not of a type you can use, it can be vendored for 20 orbs of fusing, which are used to re-roll the socket links on an item. Tip number 8, use a loot filter. If you get tired of all the on-screen clutter of totally useless junk, you can get a loot filter. These are basically sets of rules that are natively supported by Path of Exile that alter the way items show up when they drop on the ground, and can hide all the worthless junk and or draw your attention to the stuff that is or might be useful for your character or might be valuable for trade or crafting. The most commonly used filters are the ones made by Neversink, whose website is at filterblade.xyz, link down in the description. To download and install these filters, go to the website, click Save and Export, continue without saving, or you can log in if you want, and then get all strictnesses. This will download a zip file which you'll then want to extract. The easiest way to find the folder where you'll place the filters is to open the Options menu in Path of Exile, go to the Game tab, and click the folder on the item filter line to open the location where you'll put the filters. They are then activated in-game by selecting the item filter you want to use and then clicking save. Stricter filters hide more items than less strict filters, and you'll want to spend some time scrolling down the main page of the Filter Blade website to see why certain items appear the way they do. You'll also need to periodically update your filters so they'll show new items when a new league starts, as well as changed appearance of items due to shifts in trade values and whatnot. I generally tend to go with a less strict filter when playing through the campaign and early maps, but by the time I'm well established in a league, I will go pretty strict, as at that point I'm not interested in most rare drops and want to focus on currency items and items that are actually valuable. As you get more familiar with the different types of item drops, what's good both for your character or whatever else you're interested in, you can also use the Filter Blade website to create and modify your own custom filters. Pretty handy. And our final tip for the video is tip number 9, learn to use vendor recipes. Path of Exile has a robust vendor recipe system where selling various items and combinations of items rewards you with more different items that are sometimes quite useful. Particularly for new characters, there are a handful of recipes that are extremely powerful and can be used to get you a weapon that will work well for big chunks of the main story campaign. Specifically, if your character uses spells that deal fire, lightning, or cold damage, you can craft great leveling weapons by selling a magic quality scepter, wand, or rune dagger, along with an orb of alteration and a resistance ring corresponding to the damage type: ruby for fire, topaz for lightning, and sapphire for cold. There are 3 levels of this recipe that produce increasingly stronger results. The lowest level, which will require your character to be level 8 to use the resulting item, uses a normal white ring, while the middle level, which requires level 14, uses a magic ring, and the highest level, which requires player level 20, uses a rare ring. The rings themselves can be crafted by selling an iron ring with a skill gem to the vendor, red for fire, blue for cold, and green for lightning. This will always produce a normal white ring, but it can be changed to magic by hitting it with an orb of transmutation, or to rare by using an orb of alchemy or an essence. If your character doesn't use spells, but instead uses skills that deal physical attack damage, there's a similar recipe where you sell any rarity weapon along with a blacksmith's whetstone and a rustic sash that is magic, rare, or unique. The higher the rarity, the better the outcome. And if you're using spells that don't deal fire, cold, or lightning damage, you can make a good weapon by selling a dagger, scepter, wand, or staff, a blacksmith's whetstone, and a magic, rare, or unique chain belt to get a nice boost to the item's generic spell damage. These are the recipes that are generally most useful for new characters, but there are tons of other options, and it's a good idea to periodically review the vendor recipe page on the wiki, link down in the description. At this point, you now have enough knowledge and information that you should be able to start playing the game with confidence, and should try making it through the full main story campaign with 1 or more characters. Doing so will give you in-game experience that will serve you well and help you understand topics I'll cover in the remaining videos of these guides, where I'll talk more about game mechanics, help you find fixes if your character gets stuck, discuss how to buy and sell items with other players, and explain how to find and use good beginner-friendly build guides as you transition into playing in the post-campaign endgame. Thanks for watching. Be sure to smack that like button if you found the video helpful or informative, and let me know down in the comments if you have any questions about anything. And I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!